Hello, I am Pat Iyer. This is the Legal Nurse Podcast. You're in the right spot to get the benefit of the experience that our next guest, Jean Cooper, brings to the table. Jean has a master's degree in nursing, a long experience working for the Veterans Administration Service. She's worked in-house as a legal nurse consultant. She's now an independent legal nurse consultant based in Phoenix, and has a true passion for working on criminal defense cases, a topic that we're going to go into in today's podcast. Some of you who are listening to this might have a background in emergency department nursing or been in areas where you have had concern about child abuse. And certainly that is a topic that comes up for criminal defense attorneys and can be challenging. It is a topic that raises a lot of emotions, raises proof issues, and with individuals who can't tell you necessarily what happened. So I thought we would start, Jean, with focusing on when a couple of law enforcement officers are involved in helping to get medical personnel to a scene when there is a suspicion of child abuse and this child goes into the emergency department. Tell us about the potential biases that the parents or the perpetrator of this alleged crime. What are some of the biases that influence the way that situation is handled?
Well, thank you for asking, and thank you for having me here today. I think what happens is that there's an assumption of all of the adults in the room, the law enforcement, the healthcare providers, and anybody else who might encounter this situation. They assume that no children should ever be harmed by anyone. And they are the protectors of this particular child in this particular situation. So that's one thing, that no child should ever be harmed. And yes, indeed, no child should ever be harmed or come to harm. But sometimes there are accidents that are unavoidable. However, the law enforcement pretty much has an assumption that there is no accident, that nothing is not preventable. And the adults in the room or adult in the room must be responsible for this child's injury. Years ago, when we think about child abuse, and I'm talking about in the 50s, physicians, when they encountered something that might look like child abuse, didn't often report it. The assumption was that this was a family matter and no one could interfere with that family matter. It needed to just, the healthcare group had to do the best they could to take care of that child at the moment that child was in their care. But primarily they were returning to the home where something might have happened or not, where the injury occurred. Then in the late 60s, physicians in England developed the notion that physicians in the ER were best suited to recognize the evidence of child abuse. And so there was a new pediatric medicine discipline developed as child abuse pediatricians, and you could become certified as a child abuse pediatrician. So that has its own, but the title itself has its own biases. And many children's hospitals have several physicians who are certified as child abuse pediatricians. So it leads a direction, it leads us all in a direction of whatever injuries happened, they were preventable, and the adult in the room did it. So, and once that bias is determined, the investigation of any other causes except for abuse is kind of just thrown out the window. Yeah, and so they go down that road. Let me see. And all the providers, not all the providers, but many of the encounters throughout the situation, throughout the episode, from the very beginning of law enforcement being there and forming their determinations, to the emergency medical service people forming their determinations, to the ER nurses, doctors, social workers, physician extenders, and then anybody else who just happens to be by, the chaplains. They form their own opinions based on their personal value and belief systems that we all bring to work every day, that we try to filter out, but doesn't necessarily happen. I know I'm becoming too wordy here. So the police officer who sees the untidy household of a single African-American woman, and we're in Arizona, they have a preconceived notion that this household is chaotic because it's untidy. It's got to be very stressful because this woman is a single mom and maybe she's young. She had to have been overly stressed and took it out on the child. So the child stopped breathing. So that's one thing that starts right then, is that, well, the mother was involved and the mother was alone with the child. So who can refute that? Even if there's another child in the apartment or in the room, nobody entertains a different notion. EMS might document that there were bruises. Well, the only way a kid gets a bruise is if somebody hurts them, right? Well, no, not necessarily. Then somebody might make an offhanded comment, like in this case, as the child was being wheeled through the emergency room, a nurse said she beat the hell out of that baby. Well, okay, so now everybody's already thinking that, and there are more bruises happening every time the kid is touched, right? And we talked a little bit the first time about fragility and stuff, but when somebody is critically ill and has, say, clotting issues, coagulation issues, every time you touch that child, they get bruised. So, so as time goes on, there are more and more bruises revealed, and that is the difficulty. Then perhaps there's a seniority of medical providers. The neurosurgeon is, well, in some of our hospitals here, they are the gods of everything. So if the neurosurgeon decides that this child was abused and that he or she sees absolute evidence of abuse, like a subdural hematoma, and maybe they look in the eyes and see retinal hemorrhages, and they see brain swelling, well, it is child abuse with no other thought. Even if, in our case, the radiologist did not support the neurosurgeon's notion that there was a skull fracture, the radiologist determined that what they were seeing was a widened suture in the child's skull rather than a fracture. But the neurosurgeon held his opinion, and so the rest of the team held that opinion. The nurses.
That's one of the things, Jane, that we do see is that, and certainly not confined to child abuse cases, but situations where a healthcare provider comes up with a diagnosis and then looks for the evidence that will support that diagnosis and rejects the evidence that is contrary to the diagnosis. So that process, tell us a little bit about how that has an impact when it goes on in the in the system that we're discussing, where there is a child who's injured, the suspicion turns to the adult in the environment, and then other potential diagnoses are rejected.
Well, and we can use our case as an example. There was evidence of other things, other health conditions for this child, but the treating team did not pay attention to it. And after 2 days of treatment, the child died. So they jumped to the conclusion. I totally lost my train of thought with your question. So what happened was that I think the team did not look at the fact that the baby was so sick that chest X-ray and chest CT showed evidence of pneumonia and advanced pneumonia. She probably aspirated repeatedly leading up to her unresponsiveness. They did not investigate or think that the retinal hemorrhages could have been caused by something other than intentional head trauma, something like anoxia, no oxygen to the brain, will cause the brain to swell. As the brain swells, it pulls on things and end up resulting in retinal hemorrhages. And she had coagulopathy. She had blood clotting problems. So retinal hemorrhages could have happened for that reason. So they did not investigate any reason for any of these other things. The bruising that became more and more prominent, they did not look at the fact that she had sepsis by this time, overwhelming infection, which causes coagulopathy or poor clotting. So her bruises just continued. And the thing that I wanted to talk about was the social implications of these systemic problems. So here's mom, and she's got this very sick child. The child's she's overwhelmed, but everybody would be overwhelmed by the circumstances and the healthcare system. And she's getting no support from anyone in that system because they assume that she was the cause of this child's condition. So she was allowed to be at the bedside, but people did not, based on the documentation, people did not treat her kindly. As soon as the child died, the police detective whisked her away from the bedside. She was not allowed to grieve the loss of her child. And if you might remember from part one, she had another child in the house living with her. She was not able to see that other child. So she lost 2 children that day. She also lost her freedom abruptly. She was whisked off to jail. And then the whole process started. So in this case, the system failed the family. And she was accused of abusing her child to the point that the child died that day. Does that answer that question?
It does. And I know from what you just shared that our listener is going to say, hey, I want to go back and listen to the story of what happened to this woman so that I get a better sense of the sequence of events. As a legal nurse consultant working on criminal defense cases, what are some of the common requests that come to you from your clients?
Well, we can use this case for an example, but I kind of will bounce around a little bit because there are other things that we get asked to do for other cases. But with this case, I was asked to review the medical records and help the attorneys develop some focus. This case was a post-conviction relief case. And just briefly, our client had been in prison for around 10 years by the time that she had been convicted of life in prison without parole. And she felt that she was not guilty. So she petitioned the court for post-conviction relief. That means she was asking the court to look at the circumstances of her case and maybe change the sentence to whatever. So I was asked to review the medical records to look at the issues of the case, see if there was any missing or new information that we could give to the court, because the court will not look at old information that was already processed and already decided upon, adjudicated in the first go around. So we discovered that so my purpose was to review the records, discover if there is any missing information, any missing record, just like you would do with other reviews for other kinds of litigation. And we discovered that during the trial, the first attorney did not request the actual imaging, the films. And in those days, they were actual images on those big X-ray things that you put on a box and look at them. There also was some missing, they had never asked for mom's health records during pregnancy or complete delivery records. So my job was to review and see what was missing. I was also, so one of the other things that a nurse can do in these cases is when you're looking at the issues, consider what kind of expertise you would need to be able to support the opinions or assessment that we make of the case. What medical experts can support our hopes? And so we identified that we needed a pediatric neuropathologist. They are very far and few between. So I helped them figure out who they wanted to contact, and we vetted that expert. We also needed an emergency room pediatrician to discuss the events in the emergency room. We also needed an infectious disease doctor to look at the pneumonia and the sepsis and any other kind of infection that might have influenced her condition. What I did also was ask for family photos. I wanted to see what this child looked like, because in reviewing the medical records and looking at the child's neonatal and pediatric care, the growth and development charts, we all know those pink and blue charts with all that stuff that you have to figure out that's really difficult, height and weight and head circumference. It appeared that she stopped growing between 3 and 6 months. No healthcare providers nor the family really recognized that. But there was evidence of it when we looked at family photos. The child looked extremely different in expression, in size, and body language. She definitely was different. And by 10 months old, when she died, she was nonverbal, not crawling, not sitting up on her own. Clearly, there were issues about her. So we also hired a pediatric geneticist to look at some of the possibilities of genetic abnormalities for this child. All of that to prove our case that mom was not guilty of the blunt force head trauma that the entire care team, including the medical examiner, determined was the cause of this child's death.
Before we continue with the show, I'd like to share this special announcement with you. If you wrote about the XYZ Corporation, the first thing you would need to do would be to change the name, the location, and what the company sold. These people are your customers. You owe them the right not to have their private business published, and it's so bad for future business. When it comes to telling stories about your personal life, be very careful when using stories about your spouse, your children, or your closest friends. They won't thank you if you do so without getting permission. Always consider the possibility that you're giving up too much information. People have different levels of candor and openness. Beyond the standard range lie two extremes. Some people don't want or to reveal anything personal about themselves. They might, for example, not want to reveal frustration with a coaching session. Perhaps they don't want to appear lacking in confidence, or because it's nobody's business. Impersonal writing, though, creates a speech, article, or book that's like a business card in shades of gray, even if it's loaded with stories. Potential customers want to have an initial sense of whom they might be hiring. The reclusive author gives no clues. At the other extreme are authors who lack filters. In writing a book about negotiation techniques, they might include personal family details and may tell stories that have nothing to do with the theme of the book. They muddy the waters and they divert attention away from their expertise. Find a happy medium. You might need to expand your comfort zone a little. You might need to develop filters. Do what will present yourself as an engaging, friendly, thoughtful individual who works well with people and knows what he or she is talking about. I'm Pat Iyer, the author of Powerful Storytelling in Business, How to Captivate Your Clients. My book has many more recommendations for storytelling. Give your writing an upgrade by getting it at patiyer.com/books. Now let's return to the show.
So one of the things about doing these cases, or any case that a legal nurse consultant is involved in, is that you look at the medical records constantly and repeatedly. You become intimate with them. And I must say that every time I go back to the medical records, I can pick up some new something, or I've spoken to an expert, because we do interact with the experts. Part of our job is to be the conduit of information between the attorneys and the experts, because one speaks law and one speaks medicine. We speak both, so we can help with that. But when we talk to the experts, they bring up a notion that, oh, gee, maybe that's in the medical record. So we go back over and over again. We assist the attorneys in developing questions when during the criminal process, the attorneys interview providers and police and the family and the experts. We help to develop questions that are revealing of information that we want them to tell us. So the legal nurse consultant works on that. Also, we constantly are looking at medical literature to support the notions that we develop based on the information in the medical records. Like, did this kid have diabetes? What possible medical conditions could have led to this child looking the way she did? What could possibly have caused her to stop growing at some time between 3 and 6 months? So we get to do medical literature research and read the articles and can condense them, analyze them, summarize them for the attorney group, and also talk to the experts about any articles that they have that we can use to support our case. So we're involved all the way along. Then as the case progresses, we also get to go to, I get to go to jury selection, which is really interesting too. We can help develop questions for the attorneys to be able to pick the best jury for this case. And so we as the observers can sit back and listen to the questions that are asked and answered and look at body language and interaction that the potential jurors have between the attorneys and between each other, between them and the attorneys and between each other. And the attorneys don't have time to look at all of these nuances. They're still trying to work on what their job is to be questioning. Then after all of that, and we go to trial with the attorneys to be the support there. Again, we're watching for body language constantly to see who's paying attention, who's not paying attention. How can the attorney address the jury and the judge differently? Same content, but differently to further engage them. And we also are there to provide support in that, oh, there's that page in the medical record, or this is what you need to be looking at. So it's a fascinating process. Mm-hmm. So it's involved all the way along.
All of those combinations of skills, Jean, to think about education, research, analysis, observation. You've described several things that make a legal nurse consultant valuable to a criminal defense attorney and other attorneys as well.
Yes, I did. And so, one of the things that we have to remember is that not all cases are successful. We work very hard, and the team works very hard. And sometimes we are not as successful as we were with this case, where we resulted in getting our client out of prison after, well, it was about 14 years by the time we got her out of prison. So as nurses, we also support the other team members. It's quite a social environment working with the legal team, and it's intense. I think that criminal cases that I have been involved in are really intense and emotional. So we need to be prepared for that and do a lot of self-care also. So,
is there anything that you can say to a legal nurse consultant who was considering working on criminal defense cases?
Go for it. It is exciting. It's interesting. And it's rewarding. They take a long time. Our case from start to finish kind of for me was 4 years. So be prepared for that commitment that, just like other cases, has a very active time, maybe in the beginning, and then it quiets down, and then it becomes active again, quiets down, and so on. So I just realized that it's very interesting, and our goal, our mission as nurses is to help people, and you can really impact someone's life by being involved with these cases.
I know that our viewer is going to want to know how to reach you, Jean, to find out more about you and the services you offer. What would be the best way for that contact to take place?
You can email me at Jean, Jean, Cooper 4997 @gmail.com. You can look at my website, all one word, Jean K. Cooper LNC.com. Or if you want to get a hold of me quickly, you can call me at 602-616-9855.
Thank you, Jean. It is amazing and gratifying to know that the 4 years of effort did result in such a positive outcome to get the child's mother out of prison and to be able to enjoy the freedoms that we all take for granted.
Yes, indeed. And luckily, I still have contact with her, not daily, but I must say, probably weekly. She texts me. She's younger, so she texts. She doesn't call.
Very nice. Well, thank you so much, Jean, for sharing your knowledge and pulling together the pieces of this story. We appreciate your knowledge. We appreciate you. And we appreciate you who's watched this podcast on our YouTube channel on Legal Nurse Business. Legal Nurse Podcast is also available on audio channels, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And you can listen to it or watch it on our website at podcast.legalnursebusiness.com. That's also where you can go to request the transcripts of our podcasts or to request the bundles of podcasts that we have assembled. We've got a group of 6 different topics and 4 shows per topic that you can go through for a deep dive and get the benefit of the most downloaded podcasts. These are our top podcasts for the previous year that will give you those tips and the knowledge that you need from our experienced speakers. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next show. Hey, welcome back to Legal Nurse Podcast. Coming up next, we have an experienced legal nurse consultant, Gayla Rutledge, who has developed a service called RN Callback. And you're going to hear in this podcast how Gayla helps attorneys save an enormous amount of time and effort and money by screening out non-meritorious cases and also economically obtaining medical records. Gayla provides the service as an independent legal nurse consultant for a law firm. Gayla, what were some of the topics that we covered in your podcast?
Well, we talked about a new marketing strategy to increase business. We talked about how to effectively screen cases of merit or cases that have no merit. We talked about how do you work through that process? How effective is it for the attorneys and their law firm as their perception to other law firms and even to the community? And we talked about how I charge and have increased my business each month.
This is an extraordinary podcast. You're going to be wanting to see this to get a sense of how this service works and to be intrigued. Is this something that would work for you? Be sure to watch the next podcast coming up with Gayla Rutledge on the RN callback system that she uses, and think about whether this is something that's right for you. Stay tuned to Legal Nurse Podcast.